And now, Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live. We have joining us today Joanna Dodd Massey, who wrote this terrific book, Culture Shock, Surviving 5 Generations in One Workplace. Joanna is also a speaker and a corporate communications consultant. Joanna, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Now, from what I understand from reading your book, we've got 5, and frankly, we're almost going on 6 generations of folks that are working together, right? I'm going to very quickly rattle them off. We've got the silent generation, the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. Wow. Navigating all in one space, whether it's virtual or we're all sort of clumped together at work. That's a lot to deal with. So talk to me about that and about your book.
Thank you. And yes, you nailed it. Basically, we've got these 5 generations at work and we've never had it before. And the reason we've got it is because people are living healthier, they're living longer, and they're not retiring at the traditional age of 65. So you've got older people in the workforce who weren't before. So essentially you have as young as 18, or depending on the office situation, maybe 20, 22. And then you've got as old as 80 or even older. And all, look at politics or the entertainment industry, the financial industry, or healthcare, for some of those older generation workers who don't, or legal, who don't need to leave their positions until they're ready to.
Isn't that the truth? I mean, look at our candidates, right, this year for president. I mean, who would have thought that both of them would have been of that age, right?
Right. Well, you've got 2 candidates for president who are in their mid to late 70s, but then also running for president. At one point, you had Bernie Sanders and also Elizabeth Warren, both also in their 70s. So that you had a huge pool of people who were over 70 years old. So yeah, we're seeing it a lot in politics.
And to your point, because I think about this all the time, especially covering politics and being in the news, I think about that, like, they have plenty of experience, but can they understand what's necessary for the new generations coming up? I always sort of like to stay middle of the road with that, 40s, 50s, maybe a little bit over that, because you want to make sure they understand all sides, but that's a whole different subject. Let's talk about, let me throw this at you. Who's the hardest working generation? Like really just gets in there and rolls up their sleeves and doesn't complain?
I will go with the baby boomers, and then behind that, Gen X. The baby boomers are the original workaholics, okay? They were the ones who were in the C-suite when the BlackBerry was invented. In fact, they invented the BlackBerry. So this whole 24/7, 365 thing works really well for them. Gen X, which is nicknamed America's middle child because they're sandwiched between the boomers, who are a huge generation, and millennials, who are also a huge generation. So Gen X is this tiny little generation. Gen X just came into the workforce and sort of followed the boomers and didn't really ask a lot of questions. So they also have a workaholic tendency.
Boomers are interesting because they were the ones who were sort of the hippies, right? And then all of a sudden they became the yuppies, and it's like, work and money and all that was so important. And by the time I came along, I started to think, wait a minute, you left everything for me to clean up. So you're right a little bit about the whole Generation X thing. Because I think sometimes we're scratching our heads and we're going, wait a minute, what's left for us? So you're right, we're a little quiet. We're trying to just figure out where we belong still. And then the millennials come along. Are they not the largest generation after the boomers? Am I right?
They are the largest generation in the workforce. Gen Z is actually the largest generation in the United States right now. Period. So that has to do with the amount of them that were born. It also has to do with the amount of, as the boomers and the silent generation and die off. Sorry.
Yeah. So what are the, well, it happens to all of us.
Yes.
So the Generation Z, what's the age range?
So Gen Z, I use Pew Research numbers because Pew is a very well-respected social sciences research organization. You could Google this and you'll find a whole spread of numbers. Yeah. But I use Pew, and Pew says 1997 to 2012. There's some debate about that 2010 or 2012, but essentially that puts Gen Z roughly between the ages of 10 and 23 this year.
Interesting. So what are some of the work habits, let's say, because a lot of the bosses are probably the boomers, right? And some Xers, and maybe even some silent folks that are still around working, and that's a terrific thing. But what are the differences? Let's say I'm a Gen Xer. and I'm working with someone older than me and I'm working with somebody younger than me. How do we negotiate the different styles? Because, you're right. We grew up in different times, right?
We did. We grew up in different times. And because of the way it's interesting because people have actually said to me, does this generational thing really matter? And the reality of it is the era in which you grow up in, what's happening at that time, is what influences you. And so it influences what's called psychographics. And those are your attitudes, your opinions, your lifestyles, and your interests. So it influences that. So we all do kind of, as much as we don't want to, kind of conform into a generational specter. Having said that, the way the silent generation came up, if you think about it, and this is going to make sense when I say it, they grew up during the Depression. They grew up in between World War I and World War II. They were very much of the generation where the government and the military are protectors and providers. And when they went into the workforce, it's like, orders come from the top down. That's the way it works.
And you don't question it, right?
Nope, you don't question authority. You just, you go along with it. Boomers are the original hippies. This is the generation that created the hippie counterculture movement in the 60s and 70s. They questioned everything. They fought against everything. They thought the generation before them messed it up. By the way, every generation thinks the generation before them messed it up.
This is absolutely true. There's no doubt about it. But go ahead.
And we also criticize the generations behind us. It's called generation shaming. It's an actual thing. So, yeah. So anyway, so the boomers come along. They set out to change, the world, and they have actually done a lot toward that. But they also did extremely well financially. They grew up at a really good time. They came up the ranks in the corporate world at a really positive, affluent time. They've done extremely well financially. Gen X hasn't done as well, right? Gen X came in, we followed the baby boomers. The baby boomers aren't leaving. It's harder for us to move up. We don't make as many waves. Interestingly, we're really good at translating between the boomers and the millennials. Like, we kind of get it. We're like, well, I know the boomer because I grew up with them and I've been working with them for 20 or 30 years. But these millennials make a lot of sense to me. I like what they're saying. And why do I have to be at the office between 9 and 6 if I'm getting my work done?
That has always been me. I would be sitting in a newsroom just waiting for a catastrophe to happen. And I would say, let me just go get a sandwich and call me. Just give me a call if something happens. And at that time, it's like, no, you got to just sit there. But now, of course, that's different. We're home, we're on the field, we're wherever. But I was one of those people who would always question, like, why? So I actually really relate to millennials a lot. I actually think they're very sensible, right? If you don't need to sit there, don't sit there. If there's a lot of extra work to do, we'll do the extra work. I think they're actually pretty smart.
What's really interesting too, to your point,
yeah,
the boomers are for the most part the ones that raised millennials. If those are the parents of the millennials. And what the boomers said to the millennials were, they taught them work-life balance. They taught them to set boundaries. They said, do as I say, don't do as, do as I say, not as I do, right? Don't give up your whole life for work. And, and they watch mom and dad on the BlackBerry and now the iPhone or whatever it is while they, I'm having my soccer game, my little millennial kids having the soccer game, and mom and dad are working basically. And so millennials came into the workforce and they said, I'm not going to do that. I was taught not to. And the funniest part is the boomers are looking at them and they're saying, whoa, hold on a second. That's totally okay if you're my kid, but not if you're my employee. It's like, sorry guys, you can't have it both ways. Like, you taught this to them, they're bringing that into the workforce. Now we've got to deal with it.
Okay, but with COVID and just about most people are working home, I think a lot of businesses and folks are realizing, maybe this virtual thing does work. You don't have to show up and do your time and hang out at the water cooler, which is such a bore to me. Just let me get my work done. I'll be as friendly as you want, but let me just get done what I have to get done, right? Don't you think maybe all the generations are realizing when you're forced to do it, it works, right?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. And interestingly, it's well known at this point, since we've been doing COVID now for 5 to 6 months, that there are some dramatic shifts that are happening that we resisted, that human beings resisted, that now have become completely acceptable. So I absolutely think we're going to see massive changes in the workforce, in the way that we work, where we work, travel, business travel, I think will change dramatically also. So, but yes, it was helpful in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about that, right? Of course, we've got all kinds of virtual meetings now. They work. They do. You don't have to rush, pack a suitcase, get to the airport. What? To sit at a board meeting or to sit in a meeting that you very easily could do, navigate and negotiate just the way the two of us are. See, this stuff works for me. But let's see how it continues in the future. But also look how things are going to change with real estate space, office space. What are you hearing about that? I am curious. A lot of it's sitting empty, right? Yeah.
A lot of it's sitting empty. New York City, which is where I am, particularly has a huge, right now, our rental market, and this is residential, not even commercial. Residential rental market is somewhere around 4% vacant, which is high for New York City. It's very unusual. And this won't be surprising, but Silicon Valley is on the forefront of, hey, we don't ever need to come back to the office again. They're talking about this concept of office hotels, where the office basically becomes like a hotel where you come, you you reserve a space, you reserve the conference room, you're really in it for a day, maybe two, and then the rest of the time you're working from elsewhere.
Yeah. And also these pods are starting to come up. If you don't have enough room in your home, right, you could put a little pod out in your backyard. I mean, home office has never been so popular, right? It's pretty amazing. So it'll be interesting to see.
I have to tell you, sorry, go ahead.
This stay once we get through this pandemic, whenever that might be. But now let's talk about Gen Z. How are they different from millennials? And let's talk a little bit more about millennials, because they seem to be very flexible, right? They get a bad rap, in my opinion. A lot of people are like, oh my God, they're like really flaky. They won't show up. And I feel like they're more smart. It's like, why do I need to be there if I'm not productive? Am I right about that?
I think you are. And I defend millennials a lot in my book. And I explain why I defend them. And because I'm trying to sort of educate older generations, because a lot of the older of my peers or colleagues, whatever, who look at them and they say they're entitled, they're lazy, you know, all these kind of shaming type of titles. And I don't believe that at all. I believe that we brought them up differently. We brought them up with different morals, and they're exhibiting that in life and in the workforce. And now we're, like I said, we're like, wait, that was fine as a kid, not as my worker. So I don't think that they're lazy at all. I think what they've got is really healthy ideas about work-life boundaries. I think they've got very healthy ideas about what's important to them and what matters. They're extremely issues-oriented. Both generations are very issues-oriented. They care a lot about their fellow human being. They were brought up differently. And, you know, the boomers and Gen X too, you know, we were brought up in the me period of the 1980s, you know, 1990s. We were very focused on ourselves and how can I get mine? And we then turned around and educated Gen Z and millennials differently.
Yeah, I agree with that very much, but go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say, to get to your question about how millennials and Gen Z differ, there are a lot of similarities for sure, but Gen Z, millennials are born, again, these are Pew numbers, between 1981 and 1996, which puts them between the ages of 24 and 49 this year. And so that's a pretty broad range right there, because someone who was born in 1981, who knew a world of maybe 100 cable channels and Atari and, you know, no cell phone, and somebody who's born in 1995 who, you know, knew what a cell phone was and what the internet was. So that's a very broad range. But this generation, the Gen Zs, they've only known a digitally connected world. That's it. That's all they've ever known. So it is, you know, and what we did, and this is what I love about this generation. It makes me so excited as a communications executive, and I advise companies on things like this. You know, we've given this generation a megaphone called social media through the internet that they then use to speak their views and broadcast them. And they know how to use it instinctively. It is part of their DNA, and they can use it better than they can outsmart the adults like that. You know, we'll catch on quickly. The older generations will catch on quickly, but they will get us every time. And I've watched them do it in the US election right now. And it's kind of funny to watch some of the sneaky things they do to mess around with candidates that they don't like, or issues that they have a problem with. Having said that, you know, it used to be that if our generation wanted to speak up on an issue, we had to have some sort of a platform to do it. You know, you had to go through the newspapers or the TV news or the radio news, and you had to be somebody in order to be covered. So the most part, who we heard from were business leaders, politicians, and celebrities. Today, anybody can have a voice.
This is why social media is beautiful, because you can start a business on social media. I don't care if it's knitting a cap, or you have a show and you have something to say, you have a book to publish, there's cooking, there's so much you can do that I think all generations are capitalizing on, don't you? I mean, I know there's a pile of boomers that are on social media. I'm not so sure about the silent generation, but maybe, especially if you look at our president, maybe. But but you know, it also is inspiring those people too, the older folks, although I know they use it very differently, right?
They do use it differently, because this is really interesting. The majority of the generations, including what I would call the older millennials, still have a sense of privacy. They still remember a world where, like, you didn't put everything out there. There are certain things about your life you didn't want people to see. Gen Z is different that way. They are used to having like their whole life broadcast. I do want to say this, it touches on an interesting point, which is that Gen Z and younger millennials, the ones who grew up in a more digital era, they do have a little bit of a warped sense of what's real and what's not. And where this causes problems for them is we're seeing increases in depression, in anxiety, and also in suicide rates, because they think that what they're seeing on social media is real. And I take a chapter in the book in Culture Shock to point out that you see a lot on social media where people are happy, 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 and look at my beautiful family and my beautiful life. You see a lot on social media where people are, oh my God, somebody died, or my dog died, or I have this tragedy. But what you really miss is there's some middle area there.
Right. How you're living every day. You know, a little while ago, I posted a photo of my garage as we were cleaning it out. It was a disaster. And I said, sometimes you got to post this kind of stuff too. I mean, nobody really ever posts that, right? And then you've got that stuff that makes you thinner. I mean, no matter what, you know, you could be a troll and you end up looking phenomenal because of all these apps that are out there. I sometimes wonder, and what they say is you must post every day to be relevant. I wonder about that. Do you? There's this whole thing that people talk about, and I often wonder what's real and what's not, or should you just follow your own rules? What do you think about that?
I actually think you should follow your own rules. And I mentor and work with I coach a lot of women, especially, and younger women who are coming up the executive ranks. And we get in, it's not just about business conversations. I have personal life conversations with them too, because not only do I have a 30-year business degree, a 30-year career in business, but I've also got a PhD in psychology. So I do have a tendency to ask the personal questions once they feel comfortable with me. And I've had one woman that I work with that I'm thinking of in particular, who said to me a couple months ago, I think she was talking about social media, and she was really distraught because she had this friend who was on social media who looked like she was having a fabulous life. And then she ran into the girl, and it turned out that she was actually really depressed. And I said, you know, you're not seeing the full picture. People aren't giving you their real selves. This was really hard for the girl I mentor. It was really hard for her to get. It literally was a difficult concept for her brain to wrap itself around. And I really got a good look at that moment at what's happening with these younger generations and how distorted their view is of what life is. And part of what's causing the depression and the anxiety about not being able to keep up, or, you know.
Yeah, it's very important. And also all generations, you know, you're looking at what other people are doing, and then you're at home not feeling the same way. I think that causes depression, anxiety for everyone, and especially during this time of COVID, when we're really not meeting face to face at all. And you could put on whatever it is that you want people to see. It's a real danger. So let's talk a little bit about some of the people that you do consult. I know in a big way, you Sony, Disney, many medical professionals, doctors, in the world of finance. I mean, you're so well schooled. I believe that you're over at Columbia University. I mean, tell us about what you do at some of these large businesses and how you consult them. It's a big umbrella, I know, but if there's any way to tell us how you navigate those large businesses with the older workers and the younger ones. What's the balance?
It really depends on what the business is looking for.
Right.
And a lot of times a lot of the times it comes down to the corporate speaking or the advising of the executive team. And to give an example, I don't like to name names with clients. I try to keep that, but I'll just say that I went into a fashion company, a very large fashion company that has 30 different brands. And I met with the heads of HR for all 30 brands. And I gave a talk. It was a workshop. And we spent 2 hours talking about these issues and going through, first of all, I always talk about unconscious bias and what happens to people when someone's different from them and they bring in different ideas in different ways. Because as human beings, we have a natural filter that is like, it's like stops. I don't want change. We are attracted to things that are like us, that are similar, that make us comfortable. And we reject that which makes us uncomfortable, which is different. And so it's a lot of that unconscious bias is a lot of why we have diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, which I also talk about at corporations. But having said that, I go in, I educate them about that. And then I talk about the different generations. I just go through them. I talk about what, their different psychographics, as I said, attitudes, opinions, lifestyles, and interests. And then we brainstorm on solutions. How can you bring them together? I give a whole bunch of solutions about how to help people communicate better, how to help them understand each other better, things that HR departments can do in order to, recruit younger workers and retain them, because younger workers jump ship really fast. Right. So, then I go, and sometimes they'll bring me in and I'll go talk to the executive teams and things like that. So it really varies from place to place.
Interesting. You also talk about communicating and stress, right? You got to understand each other. You just do. And like you said, to your point, that's hard to do, right? You've got somebody who's 60 or 65, even older, and they're trying to look at somebody who's 25 and 30, and they're probably scratching their head going, are you kidding? Yeah, I guess the number one thing is you've got to listen. Who's easier to coach, by the way, the older folks or the younger folks? Curious.
That's a really interesting question. And honestly, I've never been asked that before. I love that. So I think that it depends is the answer. I will say that this is so intuitive. Older people are more set in their ways. So they are more challenging unless they're the kind of person who's very open to it, right? Who's open to change, who's done who's aware of the type of things, that I'm talking about. Younger people are open to suggestions, especially millennials and Gen Z. They want feedback. They want to learn. They want to know more. And so they're very open to, how do I influence my baby boomer boss? And I wrote another book called Communicating During a Crisis, Influencing Others When the Stakes Are High. And it's really just about how do you communicate and, what happens in stress, which is what I was just talking about with the brain kind of saying, I don't want change. How do you cope with that? And how do you influence people? And one of the things that I boiled it down into 3 really easy steps, which is essentially, it's really vital that you understand where the other person is coming from. So understanding is first. And by being genuinely curious, ask them, don't assume. I'll give you an example. Instead of talking generalities, let me give you a specific example. Let's say somebody turns in a project late and you're the boss, and your assumption is, that guy is always late. I mean, he's so lazy, but instead of, hey, I noticed you were late with the project again, you see how that could set up an instant defensive reaction. If instead the response from the boss is, hey, I noticed you were late. What's going on? Is everything okay? Can you tell me what happened? That's a much more relaxed, kind of not threatening perspective, and be genuinely curious in what that person has to say. What if the response from the employee was something like, I'm really sorry, my sister was sick this weekend. She had an accident, and I spent the whole, all day yesterday on the phone with family and doctors. And you can say, wow, you know what? I didn't, you should have, please tell me that. I can totally relate. I have a kid. It's really hard when my kid's sick to focus at work.
On the flip end, though, that worker can also say, I need you to know I may not have this project until noon or 2 o'clock because I have a personal situation at home. Just letting you know, I hope that's okay. So I think communication both ways is a really good idea too. Absolutely. Don't you? Because then the boss is sitting there going, wait, what's going on? But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Or the worker might say something. I mean, the other thing that you could easily hear from a millennial or a Gen Zer was just like, yeah, I got into the project, but then I got pulled onto something else. And honestly, that other thing was more interesting. I mean, there's a very...
I've had that happen to me even recently. So I get that. I think that's very irresponsible. So I understand that, believe me. What about,
but just to finish that thought, to follow up, again, it's about understanding and being really curious. You can then say to them, look, I certainly get being interested in one thing over another. Like that happens to me in business all the time, but you knew you had a deadline. Why didn't you come, can you come talk to me about that? Talk to me about what happened so that we can work through this, instead of like, that's not okay. You had a deadline, better than that.
So right? Communication. I mean, let's say it's with anything. It's with your spouse, it's with your kids. No matter what, you've got to communicate and not assume. Also, you talk about being flexible, right? And then of course, this last one is interesting. Give choices. What does that mean? Give choices.
So when people, there are a lot of psychological studies done and a lot of theories about, actually there's this one organization called the Neuro Leadership Institute. And basically it is an institute that teaches leadership based on neuroscience. This is fascinating stuff.
That's
it's a
brilliant.
US-based organization. I love it. So anyway, what they say is the Neuro Leadership Institute says, it was formed by a guy named Dr. David Rock. And what they say is when you take away someone's autonomy, meaning their ability to choose, their ability to make decisions, when you micromanage that type of thing, they become resistant. You don't get as good of a performance from them. When you give people choices, even if those choices aren't ideal, they feel like they've got some control. They've got some agency over the decision, over what's happening, and they want to make the choice. So I say that, when you're trying to influence somebody, what's really good to do is to give them choices. And I'll have to tell you, Governor Andrew Cuomo, who's the governor of New York, when he was dealing with the COVID-19 situation and it was really, really bad in New York, especially in New York City, what he said to people was, you don't have to wear a mask, but if you don't wear a mask, here's what's going to happen to your mom, to your brother, to your child, to your best friend, to your neighbor. Like, we don't want that. Like, let's take care of each other. So he did, and yes, he mandated mask wearing and made it a law and put some parameters around it. But in the way that he communicated in such a way that if you look at New York's numbers right now with COVID-19, we are below 1% for the entire state.
That's pretty incredible.
Infection rate.
The turnaround that New York faced is pretty incredible. I mean, it's been so difficult this time for so many of us, California, New York. I'm originally from back there, so I've been keeping close tabs on what they're doing back there. This has been such an interesting conversation. Anything else you'd like to add before I let you go? I mean, there's so much in the book. I'm going to, ask people to please pick it up because we're all working with different generations. It really comes down to just being flexible, like in your own home, right? Younger people and older people. But anything you'd like to add that you think is real important for people who are dealing with this right now?
Every time I talk to a group, whether it's a nonprofit, a government entity, a major corporation, individuals, whatever, I always say the same thing. And I hope that people remember it, which is that intolerance met by intolerance only leads to more intolerance. And you just have to look at Twitter if you need proof of that. So I really encourage people to both of my books are written very broadly. They're not business books. They're written for a broad audience. They've got humor in them. They're very relatable. Like just take a look at some of this stuff and shift the way you're interacting. It will change everything for all of us.
Yeah, it's very true. And just be respectful, be kind, just try and put yourself in the other person's shoes, how they might be feeling. And it's always got to be a little more difficult for the older person because you're right. They've been doing it for a certain way, but that older person also needs to be a little more flexible because they're the ones who want to stay in the workforce longer anyway, right? It's really a balance with everything. Having said that, though, I think we're really in the best place we can be because workers aren't being forced out the way they used to be, right? I mean, at least if you want to stay, there's not as much people being tossed out of their jobs. Isn't that true?
I think it depends on the industry. I mean, I think there are probably some journalists, who it depends, I think there's certainly in manufacturing, some of those jobs that require physical ability that once you get older, you just cannot do anymore.
That goes without saying. There's so much you just might not be able to do. So much I can't even do because I'm injured, for example. So I get that. Yeah.
And you do have some industries that tend to lean younger, but ironically, the entertainment industry, where I've worked a majority of my career, loves young, loves. And yet at the same time, we have some of the oldest workers are CEOs. A lot of the CEOs of the major media companies are late 60s, even up to late 70s.
Very interesting. Joanna Dodd Massey, thank you so much. Culture shock, surviving 5 generations in one workplace. Please, people, pick it up. And how can people get in touch with you on your social media, please?
Joanna Dodd Massey, absolutely, is if you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And then also my company is JDMA, which stands for JD Massey Associates. So JDMA Inc. You can find that also on on social media and on the web.
Beautiful. Thanks again for joining us today, Joanna. And be safe out there in New York, would you please?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on Deborah Kobylt Live. You can find us on Facebook, on YouTube, and then everywhere you get your podcasts, Spreaker, iHeart, Apple Podcasts, just wherever you get your podcasts, we will be there. Thank you very much for joining us. Deborah Kobylt Live.